How did exhausted infantry stop the most feared cavalry in Egypt? Most versions of this battle begin with 40,000 Mamluk horsemen charging across the desert toward Napoleon's army. The image is memorable, the number is not reliable. The force assembled to defend Cairo included cavalry, infantry, armed retainers, irregular troops, servants, and men who never entered the decisive part of the fighting. Estimates differ, but Murad Bey's elite mounted force was probably closer to 6,000 men, perhaps somewhat more. That was still enough to destroy an army that lost its formation. The Mamluks were experienced riders mounted on excellent horses. Many had trained for years with pistols, carbines, lances, and curved sabres. In close combat, an individual Mamluk could be far more dangerous than the average French infantryman he faced. Napoleon's problem was simple to describe and difficult to solve. How could he prevent thousands of mounted warriors from turning one organized army into thousands of isolated men? Before we reach the answer, leave a comment with your first instinct. Would you rather face the charge inside a tightly packed formation, or take your chances in open ground? Napoleon did not try to defeat the Mamluks at their own kind of fighting. He designed the battle so that their best qualities would have less room to operate. His victory on the 21st of July, 1798, depended on keeping the infantry together, denying the cavalry access to exposed flanks, and forcing Murad Bey to attack formations prepared to receive mounted assault. The infantry square itself was not new. European armies had used closed formations against cavalry long before the Egyptian campaign. Napoleon applied the idea on a much larger scale. Entire divisions formed large rectangles that could defend themselves from several directions while continuing to move across the field. Artillery covered the corners. Baggage, staff officers, wounded men, and the limited French cavalry remained inside. The Mamluks would not be attacking a thin line. They would be attacking a formation with no obvious rear, yet the rectangles alone did not guarantee victory.
Steady, men!
One badly timed volley, one open corner, or one battalion moving too slowly could have allowed the cavalry into the French position. Later in the battle, Napoleon would take an even greater risk. He would begin breaking parts of this defensive system apart, while the Mamluk cavalry was still active nearby. That decision would determine whether the French merely survived the charge or won the battle. To understand why Napoleon accepted that risk, we need to return to the beginning of the expedition. In 1798, France and Britain were fighting a conflict that extended beyond Europe. Britain's naval strength made a direct French invasion difficult, so French leaders considered attacking British interests elsewhere. Egypt appeared to offer such an opportunity. Control of the country could strengthen French influence in the eastern Mediterranean and threaten routes connected with British trade in India. Napoleon also imagined that Egypt might become a base for wider operations toward the Red Sea. The plan carried serious risks. Egypt was legally part of the Ottoman Empire. Invading it could bring France into conflict with another major power. The army would also depend on a long supply line across a sea that Britain had the power to contest. Napoleon accepted those dangers. At 28, he was already France's most celebrated general. His victories in Italy had brought him military prestige and growing political influence. The ruling Directory had reasons to send him away from Paris, while Napoleon saw the expedition as an opportunity to expand his reputation. A large fleet carried the Army of the Orient across the Mediterranean. The French captured Malta during the voyage and reached the Egyptian coast without being intercepted by the British squadron searching for them. They landed near Alexandria at the beginning of July. The city fell quickly, but the march toward Cairo exposed the weakness of the French position. Soldiers crossed dry country in extreme heat. Water was scarce, and food was often difficult to obtain. Many cavalry horses had not survived the sea journey in usable condition, leaving the French army with very limited mounted strength. Small groups of local horsemen could observe the French column from a distance, threaten isolated soldiers, and withdraw before the infantry could respond. The French had experience fighting European armies. Egypt required different marching arrangements and greater control over every halt. The political system they were entering was equally unfamiliar. Egypt had been under Ottoman rule since 1517, but the Sultan's authority there was limited by local power structures. By the late 18th century, leading Mamluk households controlled much of the administration, taxation, and military force. The Mamluk Beys recognized the Ottoman Sultan in formal terms. In practice, they governed Egypt with considerable independence. The word Mamluk originally referred to a military slave. Many Mamluks had been brought from the Caucasus or other regions, while young converted to Islam and trained within the household of an established commander. Some later gained followers, wealth, and political authority of their own. By 1798, they were not simply a cavalry force. They formed the military core of a ruling elite. That household system helps explain why Mamluk cavalry produced such capable individual fighters. It also shaped the political rivalries that weakened coordination inside Egypt. The relationship between those households, the Ottoman administration, and the wider population is a much larger story. A later video will examine how the Mamluks ruled Egypt before the French invasion, and why their military strength did not create a unified state. For the moment, the important point is that Mamluk warfare placed enormous value on personal skill. A mounted warrior usually provided his own horse and weapons. His effectiveness depended on horsemanship, courage, and the ability to make rapid decisions while fighting from the saddle. He could fire a pistol during an approach, change direction quickly, and close with a saber before an opponent recovered. This method worked well in raids, local conflicts, and battles where cavalry could find exposed infantry or disrupt an army before it completed its deployment. It became less effective when the enemy remained in a closed formation and refused to separate. Napoleon received an early demonstration at Shubra Kit. On the 13th of July, Murad Bey's cavalry moved around the French divisions and searched for weak points. Napoleon ordered his infantry into large rectangular formations, with baggage and vulnerable personnel protected inside. The Mamluks approached several times, but found no exposed flank. French fire kept them away. The engagement was not decisive, but it gave Napoleon useful information. His formations could resist Mamluk cavalry as long as the ranks remained closed. Murad Bey learned something as well. The French could not be treated as an ordinary marching column. Their infantry was willing to remain in position while mounted warriors moved around them. Murad withdrew toward Cairo and prepared to defend the capital from a stronger location. By the 20th of July, the French could see the pyramids in the distance. The following day, they approached Murad Bey's army near Embabeh, a village on the west bank of the Nile. The engagement became known as the Battle of the Pyramids, although the main fighting occurred some distance from the monuments. Murad Bey's position contained two distinct forces. His best cavalry stood on the open ground west of the river. Infantry, artillery, and other troops occupied a fortified camp near Embabeh. The Nile protected one side of the camp. It also left the defenders with very little room to retreat if the position collapsed. Ibrahim Bey remained on the eastern bank with another force and did not take a direct part in the main battle. The total size of the Egyptian army is difficult to establish. Some estimates approach 40,000 men or more, but these totals usually combine mounted Mamluks with infantry, irregular followers, household troops, and other personnel. They do not support the claim that Napoleon faced 40,000 elite cavalrymen. The French probably had between 20,000 and 25,000 soldiers available. They had endured a difficult march, but much of the infantry had considerable campaign experience. Their officers were accustomed to moving battalions under pressure. That experience now mattered more than speed. Napoleon placed 5 divisions across the field in an echelon, with some formations positioned ahead of others. Decisive and Renier moved toward the south, threatening the route into Upper Egypt. Murad Bey needed that road if he were forced to withdraw. Napoleon was not simply waiting behind a defensive wall. His movement placed pressure on Murad's escape route and encouraged him to commit his cavalry before the French reached Embabeh. Each French division formed a large rectangle. The front and rear faces were deeper than the sides. Artillery stood near the corners, where the guns could cover more than one approach. The baggage and vulnerable personnel remained inside. Soldiers on every outer face carried loaded muskets and fixed bayonets. These were not small battalion squares of the kind often shown in simplified illustrations. Each rectangle contained several battalions and occupied a substantial area. Its size gave it depth. Even if a few riders reached the first rank, they still faced more soldiers behind it. Horsemen moving around one face entered the view of another. Riders trying to pass between two divisions could be fired upon from both formations. The arrangement reduced the value of the Mamluks' mobility, but it created new problems for the French. Large rectangles were slow. They had to cross the field without losing alignment. Corners needed to remain closed as the divisions changed direction. The soldiers also had to resist the urge to fire too early. A musket volley delivered at long range might frighten horses, but it would cause less damage. It would also leave the infantry reloading as the cavalry reached the formation. The men had to wait. This was the moment when the battle could still have gone wrong. The famous rectangles were not the final answer. They were only the first part of Napoleon's plan. The decisive moment would come when Murad Bey committed his cavalry, and Napoleon used that commitment to attack somewhere else. If the French moved too soon, the horsemen could enter the gaps. If they waited too long, Murad might recognize the danger and withdraw before the trap developed. Napoleon needed the Mamluks close enough to be occupied, but not close enough to break the formation. Murad Bey saw the French movement toward the south and responded. He sent a large part of his mounted force against the divisions of Decisive and Renier. The Mamluks crossed the open ground quickly, attempting to strike before the French completed their advance. Napoleon later reported that the infantry waited until the cavalry was roughly 50 paces away before firing. The exact distance cannot be confirmed. Official battlefield reports often presented events in a way that emphasized discipline and control. The general sequence is clear. The French held their fire while the Mamluks approached. At close range, muskets and artillery discharged into the front of the mounted force. Men and horses fell. Wounded animals blocked riders behind them and disrupted the order of the charge. The attack did not end after the first volley. Some Mamluks continued directly toward the French. Others moved along the faces of the rectangles, looking for an opening. Groups of riders entered the interval between Decisive and Renier. That space might have been dangerous if the divisions had been isolated. Instead, the two formations supported each other. Horsemen entering the interval came under fire from more than one direction. A small number of riders still reached the French line. Some fought close to the bayonets and tried to force their horses into the formation. They could not turn these contacts into a wider breach. A mounted warrior needed space to use speed and direction. Once stopped in front of several ranks of infantry, his advantage diminished. The French soldiers did not need to defeat every Mamluk in an individual fight. They needed to prevent enough riders from entering at the same place. Men in the first ranks presented bayonets. Those behind them loaded and fired. Artillery crews near the corners engaged cavalry approaching at an angle. The formation absorbed the attack without opening. This did not happen because horses always refused to approach bayonets. Wounded or frightened animals could still be carried forward by momentum. Some reached the infantry. Depth protected the formation. A rider who crossed the first rank still faced soldiers behind it. Men on either side could turn toward the point of contact. Unless the opening widened quickly, there was no room for the riders behind him to enter. Murad's cavalry had reached the French army. It had not changed the shape of the French position. That failure created the opportunity Napoleon had been waiting for. While the Mamluk cavalry remained occupied on the open ground, French units closer to the Nile began advancing toward Embabeh. This phase is often overlooked because the cavalry charges dominate most retellings. It was the part of the battle that converted a successful defense into a victory. The divisional rectangles did not remain stationary throughout the afternoon. Parts of the formations shifted into attack columns. Other battalions remained prepared to face cavalry. General Bond's division moved toward the defenses near the village. Vial's troops helped separate the fortified camp from the Mamluk cavalry farther west. Napoleon was now asking the army to perform two different tasks at the same time. Some units continued to contain the mounted threat. Others advanced against infantry and guns. This was the dangerous decision promised earlier. The strength of a closed rectangle came from keeping every face protected. Once troops left that arrangement, they became more vulnerable. Napoleon judged that Murad's main cavalry force was too heavily committed to reorganize and strike the attacking columns at the right moment. If that judgment had been wrong, the French troops near Embabeh could have been caught while changing formation. Mamluks close to the camp did attempt another mounted attack. The French columns stopped and faced outward. Musket fire and bayonets prevented the cavalry from breaking the advance. Once a charge had been checked, the French continued toward the entrenchments. The Egyptian artillery had limited freedom to change direction. The infantry inside the camp lacked the cohesion of the French battalions approaching it. The position could resist an attack from the front. It became harder to hold once French troops reached the edges of the defenses and threatened the routes behind them. The situation deteriorated quickly after the French entered Embabeh. The Nile had helped protect the camp during the early part of the battle. It now obstructed the retreat. Defenders trying to escape found themselves crowded against the river. Some moved along the bank. Others entered the water and drowned while attempting to reach the opposite side. Murad Bey escaped south with part of his cavalry. Accounts report that he had been wounded in the face. Ibrahim Bey withdrew from the eastern bank, leaving Cairo without an effective field force capable of stopping the French advance. Casualty figures remain uncertain. Napoleon's official report claimed that around 2,000 elite Mamluks had been killed, while French deaths numbered only a few dozen. Those figures supported the political value of the victory and should be treated cautiously. Other accounts give higher French losses and broader estimates for the Egyptian side. The safest conclusion is that Egyptian losses reached several thousand, including many men killed during the collapse near the river. French casualties were considerably lower. The imbalance in losses followed from the way the battle developed. The Mamluk cavalry attacked formed infantry across open ground and lost cohesion under close-range fire. The troops at Embabeh then faced a French assault, while the strongest mounted units were occupied elsewhere. When the camp fell, the river prevented an orderly withdrawal. The French spent much of the battle inside formations designed to reduce their exposure. They suffered losses, but they were rarely placed in the same condition as the defenders trapped near the Nile. The outcome is sometimes described as a victory of firearms over cavalry. That explanation is too simple. The Mamluks also carried firearms. The defenders of Embabeh had artillery. Weapons alone do not explain why one side could use its force more effectively. The difference lay in coordination. French infantry drill allowed large groups of soldiers to wait for an order, fire at short range, and reload without abandoning their positions. Artillery protected the corners of the rectangles. Neighboring divisions covered the spaces between them. When the cavalry was contained, French units could change formation and attack the camp. Murad Bey's army could not combine cavalry, infantry, and artillery with the same level of control. The guns at Embabeh remained tied to a fixed position. The infantry could not advance reliably enough to place sustained pressure on the French rectangles. Murad's cavalry therefore carried most of the active fighting. That left the Mamluks with few ways to weaken the French before charging. A closed infantry formation was not invulnerable. Sustained artillery fire could cause serious losses. Steady infantry could force the soldiers inside a rectangle to divide their attention. Broken ground might disrupt the ranks. Panic could open a corner. Murad Bey could not combine these threats at the same time. His cavalry reached the French quickly, but speed alone did not create an opening. The French did not need to destroy the mounted force immediately. They only needed to keep it outside their position. Once they succeeded, Napoleon could direct troops against Embabeh. The battle was decided by the connection between the two parts of the field. The rectangles protected the army from cavalry. Their arrangement allowed neighboring divisions to support one another. That protection gave other units enough time to attack the camp beside the Nile. Napoleon's command mattered, but the result did not depend on him alone. Division and brigade commanders had to adjust their formations as the Mamluks changed direction. Artillery crews selected targets, while horsemen moved rapidly across the field. Infantry officers prevented soldiers from firing before the range had closed. The men in the ranks then had to remain in place while mounted warriors approached at speed. Without that discipline, the shape of the formation would have meant very little. The Mamluks were not defeated because they lacked courage or military experience. They were defeated because their strongest skills did not solve the tactical problem in front of them. A Mamluk could defeat an isolated infantryman. Murad Bey could not create enough isolated infantrymen. The French refused to break into smaller groups. Each failed approach cost the cavalrymen horses and momentum without opening the formation. The fall of Embabeh opened the road to Cairo. French troops entered the city soon afterward, and Napoleon gained control of Lower Egypt. The victory strengthened his reputation. It also appeared to show that the Army of the Orient could overcome an unfamiliar enemy despite heat, poor supplies, and its shortage of cavalry. The strategic position remained uncertain. On the 1st of August, a British fleet, commanded by Rear Admiral Horatio Nelson, attacked the French ships at Embabeh Bay. Most of the French battle fleet was captured or destroyed. The French army still occupied Egypt, but its secure connection with France had been broken. The occupation then faced resistance inside Egypt, continuing supply problems, disease, and war with the Ottoman Empire. Cairo rose against the French in October 1798. Napoleon later marched into Syria, but failed to capture Acre. He returned to Egypt and left for France in 1799. The remaining French army surrendered in 1801. The Battle of the Pyramids was therefore a clear tactical victory inside a campaign that failed to achieve its larger strategic goal. Its significance should not be exaggerated. It should not be reduced to a story about 40,000 horsemen either. Napoleon did not win because he discovered a formation that no one had seen before. He applied a known method on a larger scale and connected it to an offensive plan. His divisions were positioned so that Murad Bey could not attack one without coming under pressure from another. The movement toward Upper Egypt threatened the Mamluk retreat and drew the cavalry into battle. Once the mounted force was committed, French troops attacked the fortified camp beside the Nile. The sequence mattered. If the French ranks had opened, the Mamluks could have entered the formation and turned the engagement into close fighting. If Murad's infantry and artillery had placed sustained pressure on the rectangles, the cavalry might have found a damaged section. Neither happened. The Mamluks reached the French line, but they could not alter the conditions of the battle. Napoleon kept the engagement within a system that favored trained infantry, concentrated fire, and controlled movement. Murad Bey's cavalry had to attack that system directly, while the rest of his position was gradually separated and overrun. That is the practical explanation for the French victory near the pyramids. The number of Mamluk troops remains disputed, and the familiar claim of 40,000 cavalrymen should not be treated as confirmed fact. The central result is clearer. A smaller force of elite horsemen confronted an army whose formations denied them the space they needed. Once the charges failed to open the French ranks, the defense of Cairo began to collapse.